Hello and welcome to another interview at the People's Food Summit. And today we have the pleasure to be interviewing Timothy Wise. Tim, I'm going to do a brief introduction. You got a very impressive curricula, so I'll try to synthesize it. But Timothy Wise is a senior research fellow at Tufts University's Global Development and Environment Institute, where he founded and directed its Globalization and Sustainable Development Program. He's the author of Eating Tomorrow, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food. He has served as a senior advisor at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, IATP, and at the Small Planet Institute, where he directed its Land and Food Rights Program. Tim, it's a pleasure that we have you here. It's really an honor. You're so savvy and know so much about this issue, and it's really an amazing perspective to be able to have such a cross-border view as you bring to this topic. So thank you, and we would love to hear from you.
It's a real honor to be joining you all.
So, Tim, as you have extensive experience with all the controversy around GMO corn, and we've been interviewing other people on this same topic, on this same issue, but we wanted to hear from you with your perspective as a researcher from the US. What's your opinion? You've been following this a lot. Our audience is very familiar with it. What's your opinion? What are some of the remarks and more important parts of this controversy?
It's such an important step that Mexico has taken to challenge, to defend its native varieties of maize, and to try to improve the quality of its and safety of its food, particularly its tortillas and other products made from corn. I think the importance of this of Mexico defending itself in this very brazen challenge by the United States to Mexico's policies is that the United States government went into the conflict saying Mexico had no science to back up its claims that GM corn and glyphosate residues would be unsafe for Mexicans to eat. And Mexico has shown that the exact opposite is true, that the United States does not have the science to guarantee that the corn it is exporting, the GM corn it is exporting with glyphosate residues, is safe to eat, particularly in the way Mexicans eat that corn. 10 times as much corn as we eat in the United States in minimally processed forms, like tortillas. Mexico has shown that the U.S. regulatory system is corrupted by industry finance and interests. It has shown that U.S. regulatory decisions are based on science that is out of date. Mexico has brought a lot of new science to the table in this dispute, in its filings in the dispute. And the U.S. has had really no response. It's ignored most of the more recent science that has shown very clear evidence that precaution is warranted both in relation to exposure to glyphosate in residues and in relation to different types of GM corn that could pose risks to particularly the digestive tract in mammals. There is relatively recent evidence from the peer-reviewed literature that shows that. And instead of taking that science seriously, the U.S. government has either dismissed it out of hand or ignored it and just reverted to old assertions that GM corn and glyphosate are safe to eat. And that's just not true. So the importance of that struggle, of Mexico standing up to the U.S. and doing so in such a with such a robust defense is really an inspiration and something that's as important for U.S. consumers as it is for Mexican consumers, because we truly don't know what we're eating here either.
Thank you, Tim. And absolutely, this is equally as important for U.S. consumers as for Mexican consumers as well. Now, you point out something very important when it comes down to consumption, which is culturally speaking, it's so relevant corn to Mexican diet. One, because it's the center of origin, but also because there's direct consumption. Do you think that besides all the corporate pressures that we see on the U.S. position in this case, there's also some sort of cultural disconnection there between Mexico and the U.S.? Is that not considered at all?
That I'm sure that is a part of the disconnect here, but I honestly think corporate capture of the U.S. regulatory system and actually of the commodity groups that speak as if they are speaking for all farmers in the United States as well. The U.S. government has and the biotech industry have very much dominate those trade associations, the National Corn Farmers Association, et cetera. And so they act like they are speaking for all farmers when, in fact, Mexico's restrictions on GM corn could be a benefit for U.S. farmers, and certainly for U.S. consumers. This is what I've written with my background as an economist, is that Mexico's restrictions affect so few farmers at this point, just exporters of GM white corn to the tortilla industry, that it would be very easy for farmers who want to continue to export to the tortilla industry to simply shift to non-GM corn in the US. And they could earn a 5 or up to a 20% premium price for that at a time when corn prices internationally are falling dramatically. So the argument that they are harmed by Mexico's policies is just false. They could be actually benefiting from those policies. And if that in turn had provoked a greater market and demand in the US for non-GM corn, that would be a benefit to all of us here. As I said, we really don't know what we're eating. And the evidence every day, some new study comes out that shows another risk of glyphosate, another risk of consuming ultra-processed foods. And the U.S. has not taken a precautionary approach in its regulatory process. It has rushed products to market and sped the regulatory process to allow companies to get their products to market without adequate safeguards. We would all benefit from those safeguards, and I'm hoping Mexico's strong defense and impressive research from CONACYT, the National Science Agency, has been really, really important. And I'm hoping that we can bring that to light and bring it into the discussion in the United States of food safety.
Thank you, Tim. Absolutely. There's a robust, body of evidence of the harms of pesticides. CONACYT has done a great job about that. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, there's an argument of the lack of science from Mexico and all this. But, there was the panel actually asked about 10 NGOs and experts from Mexico to present arguments and to present cases on why there's a harm to health. There's also a lack of cultural disconnect, but there's also as well a robust body of evidence on why the corn dispute should be favorable to Mexico. Were you, as part of IATP, involved in those conversations? And maybe if you could tell the audience a little bit more on how the panel was formed and what that process was all about.
Sure. The dispute panel is a three-member set of arbitrators who were nominated, suggested by each of the countries, and ultimately agreed by each of the countries. They tend to be trade lawyers, not scientists, so this is a challenging case for them. There's a process in which non-governmental organizations can solicit the opportunity to contribute formal comments. And I think in the end, 9 NGOs were approved, invited to submit those comments, 5 of them Mexican and 4 from the US. Excuse me. Canadian organizations also asked to submit, but in the end were initially accepted and then rejected on the basis that they were Canadian, and so they were direct parties to the dispute. A decision that was controversial and excluded some important perspectives from Canada. But the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy submitted comments on the indigenous rights question. One of the important contributions of the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement that produced the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, it's the current trade agreement, is that it included an indigenous rights provision that said that even if there is a violation of the other terms of the trade agreement, that is allowable if it is to protect indigenous rights. Excuse me. The Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy and one of the Mexican NGOs submitted comments detailing how this qualified, how the defense of native corn varieties and a diet free of GMOs in its corn were part of the culturally appropriate food and protection of maize biodiversity in Mexico, and therefore should be considered as part of a recognition of indigenous rights. And that in that case, even if the panel found that Mexico had violated the USMCA, Mexico should still be allowed to carry out these provisions.
Thank you, Tim. That's very, very clear. Also, another thing is we've read the term tortilla corn ban. We keep reading this. It doesn't really represent, or at least for Mexicans, it doesn't really represent where Mexico stands on this conflict. What is this mischaracterization? Why do they keep referring to these issues, the tortilla corn ban?
I'm glad you point that out. It has been an unfortunate, the U.S. files its case, its complaint, and it gets to use whatever language it wants to describe what it's objecting to. It chose to object to, not to the glyphosate restrictions, interestingly, but to the restrictions on the use of GM corn in tortillas and the tortilla masa corn chain, and to the part of the decree that called for a gradual substitution of non-GM corn for GM corn in feed, animal feed, and other products. Both of the characterizations are really biased. The latter, the U.S. chose to call it a substitution instruction, like there was a mandate in there that the government was ordering buyers to stop buying GM corn, and that there was some deadline, and Mexico has made it clear that the language in the decree does not use the word instruction. It says sustitución paulatina, gradual substitution, gradual as supplies are made available. So what it is it's Mexico saying we would prefer to be using non-GM feed, and we want to keep looking for ways we can do that. But if it's not available, we're not going to restrict trade in any way. On the tortilla corn ban, I guess it could be argued that it's true that Mexico is banning the use of GM corn in tortillas, but the implication is that Mexico is banning corn and banning trade in corn. And so, again, it's raising the specter of a trade restriction when it's not a trade restriction. It's a restriction on use. It doesn't apply only to the U.S. It applies to any producer of GM corn from any country. So it doesn't discriminate against the U.S. And it, as I said, barely affects U.S. producers. There are very few producers who are exporting GM corn, white corn, to the tortilla industry, and those producers have the option to continue exporting corn if it's not GM. So GM corn continues to flow to Mexico. GM white corn continues to flow to Mexico, just not to the tortilla industry. So this idea of a tortilla corn ban makes it sound like a trade restriction when it's not a trade restriction at all.
Thank you for explaining that, the importance of words and terms. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. So, Tim, where do you see this going? What's happening next? Are you hopeful that this will be resolved in a favorable way? What's your instinct? But more than your instinct, what's your research and your experience and your different sources of information? Where is this dispute heading to?
It's very difficult to know. I think most of the people I've talked to feel like Mexico did a masterful job defending itself and defending its policies. But that said, and I think they definitively showed that they have science on their side. I think the biggest, I warned someone, a journalist asked me in the US, wasn't it good that Mexico was being forced to step up and show that it had science? And I said, be careful what you wish for. They have the science, and now it's going to be public, and it's going to shine a really harsh light on U.S. biotech and U.S. regulatory processes, and that's what's happened. So Mexico really, I think, won the battle on who has the science. The U.S. looks terrible in its in the ways it tried to respond, and now that said, everyone knows that these trade agreements are written to benefit multinational firms. That is kind of why we have these agreements, is because multinational firms wanted more reliable rules of trade that would benefit those who are trading internationally. And so the rules are written to benefit multinationals. So are the dispute panels. They don't tend to include food sovereignty advocates. They tend to include trade lawyers who are defending free trade and free trade agreements, and that's their experience. So it wouldn't be at all surprising if by some reading of the letter of the law in the agreement, a group of three arbitrators ruled in favor of the United States. But the dispute won't end there. And that's, I think, the important thing for everyone to realize. I think that will show that the trade agreement itself has very little legitimacy if a powerful country like the U.S. can take a measure, a domestic measure taken by Mexico that does not have a big trade impact, and use the trade agreement to try to stop that domestic policy. That will be a flashing red light on any other country that thinks about signing an agreement with the United States. That if the US can use these agreements to just undercut our domestic policies, then we should not sign these agreements. And the legitimacy of the USMCA itself gets called into question. Even more important, the new government has said that it has absolutely every intention of continuing these policies. And in fact, they're included in the constitutional reforms currently being discussed in Mexico. The exact restrictions that the presidential decree includes. So the dispute, the policy won't end, the struggle won't end. Mexico will not accept GM corn. They do not want to eat GM corn. They don't want to eat glyphosate poison in their tortillas, and I don't think the U.S. is going to be able to make them do it.
Thank you very much. And you're right. I believe the cultural battle has been won by Mexico, but the corporate takeover and the pressure of the agri-food lobby is just too strong. And finally, we know that there's a continuation of the policies here on the Mexican side. Do you think anything will change depending on who wins the U.S. election? Would there be any change on this, or is
I don't know. That's a difficult one to say. There's a very, it's been the Biden administration's U.S. trade representative that has taken this action against Mexico. Trump won't be more favorable to Mexico, that's for sure. And Kamala Harris, I don't have a reason to believe that she would take a significantly more enlightened view on this. And that's, again, partly because of the power of the agribusiness lobby in the United States. It really has, they spend, depending on the year, but many years, they spend more money on lobbying than the U.S. military does. U.S. military industries spend on lobbying in Congress. So you can't underestimate their power, unfortunately.
Thank you, Tim. Yes, it's a big thing that we're facing and that we're confronting. But again, I believe, as you said, that Mexico has been very good at presenting the case. There's scientific evidence. There's a robust body of evidence of the harms of glyphosate. So there's all that information out there, and it's always very helpful when people like you and others actually discuss these things, bring this to light, because there's a lack of information on this conflict and about this controversy internationally. Not many people are really presenting it as it is, and I think that what you do is fundamental. Just one last, probably more like personal question, but for you, what made you, we see you in Mexico when we go to the agroecology congresses in Oaxaca and in other places. Right now you're in Massachusetts, but it's not rare to see you in Mexico City or in Oaxaca or in other parts. What is it that attracts you to Mexico, or why do you come so often to Mexico? What makes you write about corn? How do you know so much about corn? What happened there?
That's an interesting question. I mean, who wouldn't want to come to Mexico and spend time there? I mean, por favor. No, es un encanto. It's a pleasure to be there, but also, I started studying Mexico in detail, in Mexican agriculture and corn in particular, because of the North American Free Trade Agreement and the impact that NAFTA had on opening up the border to U.S. exports, and the negative impact those cheap, subsidized, poor quality exports have had on Mexican producers, undercutting their markets and coming to dominate so many of the industries that so many of those sectors of Mexican agriculture. And so I continue to work on that. And it's been particularly refreshing and encouraging to see the Lopez Obrador administration take a different approach finally to some of these questions, not by trying to pull out of NAFTA or the USMCA, but by standing up for corn farmers and prioritizing domestic production of key foods in Mexico that are healthy, and improving the regulatory processes to ensure Mexicans are getting healthy foods. And that's a real inspiration. So that's really been a joy to be able to support those kind of policies with my research.
Thank you, Tim. It's been great to have you here at the People's Food Summit program. We really like what you do. We follow what you do. We'll be sharing the website on your writings and IATP. Thank you. You've been a great ally, and you know so much. You're so knowledgeable about food and policies and the intersection of those two. We appreciate you, and hope you have a great day.
Thank you so much.